Your badge number. And the name of your supervisor.
You just step back now.
I am a federal judge on the 11th Circuit. These are my credentials. Badge number. Now.
Check lane 3, non-compliant passenger, possibly
I am not hostile. I have not raised my voice. I have done nothing wrong.
Imagine you are standing in the TSA pre-check line, running on time, credentials in hand, headed to an emergency hearing at the Supreme Court of the United States. You have your federal judicial identification, your State Department travel clearance, your pre-check documentation. Now imagine an officer steps into your path, looks you in the eye, and tells you the documents are probably fake. That is exactly what happened to federal judge Felicia Grant at Miami International Airport, and the officer who did it had no idea who he was dealing with. Before this story goes any further, if this story resonated with you, I would love to know where you are watching from. Drop your city or your country in the comments right now. Tell me whether you think they got what they deserved. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because tomorrow's story hits just as hard. Share this so more people know what's really happening out here. See you in the next one. The terminal was already moving at full speed when it happened. 7:42 in the morning. Miami International Airport. The TSA pre-check lane, fluorescent lit and efficient, a line of verified travelers moving in practiced rhythm through the checkpoint. Business travelers. Early risers. People with places to be. Officer Caldwell's voice cut through the noise first. He had stepped directly into her path before she reached the entrance wide stance, hand resting on his belt, body language already settled into confrontation. His declaration was loud enough to carry over the ambient hum of the terminal. The pre-check lane was for verified passengers only, and she needed to proceed to regular screening. Judge Felicia Grant stopped. She was 52 years old, dressed in a charcoal wool suit, carrying a leather briefcase, and moving with the quiet composure of a woman who had spent 3 decades navigating spaces where people had underestimated her. She had been on her way to the gate with time to spare. She had a 9:45 flight, an 11 o'clock connection, and a Supreme Court hearing she could not miss. A federal sentencing case, one that had been expedited at the court's request, required her physical presence in Washington by 2 in the afternoon. She reached into her briefcase without raising her voice. One at a time, she produced her federal judicial identification, her State Department travel clearance, and her pre-check documentation. She held them out steadily, identified herself as a sitting appellate judge on the 11th Circuit, and explained that she was traveling to an emergency Supreme Court proceeding. Caldwell barely looked at them. He did not take the identification from her hand. He did not scan the barcode on the pre-check document. He did not examine the holographic seal, the official federal seal, or the photograph that matched precisely the woman standing before him. He looked at her face, glanced at the credentials, and shook his head. Probably fake, he said. She would need additional screening. Behind her, travelers continued moving through the pre-check entrance without interruption. A man in a rumpled suit, a woman with a roller bag, 2 colleagues in matching company lanyards. None of them were stopped. None of them were questioned. Caldwell's partner, Officer Landry, stood approximately 6 feet away and said nothing. Judge Felicia Grant had graduated from Harvard Law School at the top of her class. She had turned down corporate offers and spent 22 years in the United States Attorney's Office prosecuting organized crime, public corruption, and civil rights violations. She had sent dirty cops to prison. She had dismantled trafficking networks. She had stood before juries and argued on behalf of people who had no one else to speak for them. When the president nominated her to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, the Senate confirmed her by a vote of 91 to 8 Republicans and Democrats alike, citing her record, her fairness, and the quality of her legal reasoning. From the bench, she had issued landmark rulings on police accountability and equal protection that were taught in law school classrooms across the country. That morning, she was a woman in a charcoal suit being told her credentials were fake. Officer Caldwell had been with the Miami Airport Police Department since he was 24 years old. In 16 years of service, he had accumulated 29 formal complaints from travelers. 26 of those complaints had been filed by black passengers. The allegations included racial profiling, unlawful detention, excessive force, and verbal abuse. In 16 years, he had not faced a single disciplinary hearing. He had not been suspended. He had been promoted twice. Among his colleagues, he had a nickname. They called him the Gatekeeper. It was not meant as a compliment by those who understood its meaning. He had developed a pattern of positioning himself near pre-check and priority boarding lanes and targeting black travelers for additional scrutiny. A black cardiologist carrying hospital credentials had been turned away and forced through secondary screening 3 times in a single calendar year. A retired military officer traveling in uniform had been detained for 40 minutes because Caldwell found his bearings suspicious. A federal contractor with active security clearance had missed an international connection after Caldwell spent 25 minutes interrogating her about documents she was not legally permitted to explain to him. Every complaint filed against Caldwell had landed on the desk of Lieutenant Harlan, his direct supervisor. Every complaint had been dismissed. Insufficient evidence, conflicting accounts, no available footage. The language changed, but the outcome never did. Caldwell walked away clean each time, and each time he did, the lesson was the same. There would be no consequences. He had learned it well. Judge Grant stepped to the side of the lane as instructed. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She complied, without giving him any ground to escalate. And then, calmly, she asked for his badge number and the name of his supervisor. Caldwell reached for his radio. The call went out within seconds. Backup requested at pre-check lane 3. Non-compliant passenger, possibly hostile. Judge Grant had not moved. She had not raised her voice. She had not touched anyone or anything. The cameras positioned at 7 angles throughout the terminal concourse recorded all of it, the stillness of her posture, the steadiness of her hands. And the moment Caldwell put his radio away and stepped toward her, his hand closed around her upper arm with a force that would leave bruising visible for the next 3 weeks. He yanked her toward the wall and shoved her forward. Her briefcase hit the floor and burst open, legal documents scattering across the tile in every direction. Travelers nearby gasped. Several reached for their phones. A child, standing with his mother at a nearby gate, began to cry. Caldwell leaned in, and his voice was loud enough for every microphone in the terminal to capture every word. "You people always think you are above the law." Judge Grant turned her head slightly. Her cheek was near the wall. Her voice was steady. "Officer, I am the law." Caldwell did not pause. He pulled his handcuffs from his belt and grabbed her right wrist. The motion was fast and brutal and entirely unnecessary. He wrenched her arm behind her back with a violent twist that partially separated the shoulder from its socket. The pain was immediate and severe. Before she could respond, he slammed her forward onto the metal screening table. Her face struck the surface hard. Her glasses shattered on impact. A shard of the lens sliced into her cheek just below her left eye, and blood began running down her face immediately bright red against the stainless steel, visible on every camera, recording the scene. Caldwell drove his knee into her upper back and pressed his full weight down onto a 52-year-old woman with a dislocated shoulder and an open wound on her face. "Should have thought about that before you got uppity." Landry stepped forward once, just once. He opened his mouth, and Caldwell cut him off without looking back. "Shut up, Neil. I know how to handle these people." The cameras recorded everything. The blood pooling on the stainless steel, the scattered pages of a federal court brief lying across the floor, the knee pressed into her spine. The exact words chosen, every second of it documented, time-stamped, preserved across 7 independent systems. Phones across the terminal were already recording. The footage was already uploading. The terminal concourse had gone almost completely silent, the ordinary sound of morning travel swallowed by the weight of what everyone had just witnessed. Caldwell stood over her, breathing hard. Judge Felicia Grant lay pinned against the metal table, bleeding, her arm wrenched at an angle that spoke plainly of injury, her documents scattered around her like evidence that had already been filed. The question was no longer what had happened. 7 cameras had answered that. The question was, what would happen next? The paramedics arrived at 7:59. They came in through the service corridor on the east side of the terminal, 2 of them, moving fast with a kit and a stretcher, summoned by a TSA shift supervisor who had heard the commotion from across the checkpoint and understood immediately that this was not an ordinary situation. The crowd had grown. Phones were still recording. The footage was still uploading. Chief Victor Kane arrived 2 minutes after the paramedics. He pushed through the gathering crowd with the practiced authority of a man accustomed to being the largest presence in any room. He was 58 years old, 24 years with the department, and he had the look of someone who had spent 2 decades smoothing things over before they became problems. He reached the TSA supervisor first. She leaned in close and spoke quietly, and the color left his face in a single, visible moment. He had just been told the woman lying against the screening table, bleeding, shoulder partially dislocated, her briefcase contents still scattered across the floor, was Federal Judge Felicia Grant of the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. Cain crossed to Caldwell in 4 steps and told him to remove the handcuffs. His next moves were careful and deliberate, the moves of a man already thinking 3 steps ahead. He approached Judge Grant with measured concern, offered her private medical attention in a secured administrative room, and suggested that a matter of this nature could be addressed through the department's internal review process. His tone implied resolution. His words implied discretion. He spoke in the way of someone who had seen situations like this before, or believed he had and knew how to contain them. He also, in those same 2 minutes, quietly instructed 2 officers, standing at the edge of the crowd, to approach civilian witnesses and ask them to hand over their phones. The man in the gray suit had been watching from the moment Caldwell stepped into Judge Grant's path. He was 62 years old, tall, with the composed stillness of someone trained to observe and document. His name was Captain James Hargrove, retired United States Marshal, 31 years in federal law enforcement, the last 12 spent supervising fugitive operations across the Southeast. He had been in line behind Judge Grant when it started. He had not moved from his position since. When Cain's officers began approaching witnesses, Hargrove stepped forward. He identified himself with the economy of someone who had done it thousands of times: name, rank, agency, retired status, and he made clear, in language that admitted no ambiguity, that the request to surrender civilian recording devices had no legal basis. Federal law protected the right to record police conduct in public spaces. Any attempt to seize or pressure witnesses into surrendering footage would constitute obstruction. He was already recording. He would continue recording. And if any officer touched his phone, he would personally ensure that the incident was referred to the Department of Justice before the end of the business day. Cain's officers stepped back. By that point, Judge Grant had been helped to a sitting position by the paramedics. Her right arm was immobilized. A gauze pad was pressed against the wound below her left eye. Blood had dried along the line of her jaw and stained the collar of her charcoal suit. She looked at Cain with the clear, focused attention of someone who had spent 22 years reading the behavior of people under institutional pressure. Cain tried again. His voice was quieter now, more careful. He spoke about the review process, about the department's commitment to accountability, about his personal assurance that the officer's conduct would be examined thoroughly and fairly. He spoke as though the cameras were not still rolling, as though Hargrove was not still recording, as though the 7 security feeds overhead were not already preserving everything in time-stamped detail. Judge Grant let him finish. Then she looked at him, this man who had built a career on knowing when to contain a situation, and she answered him with the precision of someone who had prosecuted cover-ups at every level of government. She told him, without raising her voice, that she had spent 22 years watching institutions attempt to manage accountability rather than practice it. She recognized what he was doing. She had prosecuted men for doing exactly what he was attempting to do right now. Cain had no answer for that. The paramedic pressed fresh gauze to her cheek as his words hung in the air and the cameras kept rolling. If this story has you gripped like this video, subscribe, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. If this moment of raw injustice hits home, type "exposed" in the comments below and share this video so more eyes stay on stories like hers. Judge Grant made one phone call from the terminal floor. She did not call the airport director. She did not call the airline. She did not call her clerk or her security detail or the court administrator waiting for her arrival in Washington. She called the FBI field office in Miami and identified herself, her location, the nature of the incident, and the names of the officers involved. She said she would not leave the terminal until federal agents arrived. She did not leave the terminal. Landry had gone quiet. He had positioned himself at the far edge of the crowd, arms crossed, watching the scene with the expression of a man rapidly recalculating something. He had said nothing since Caldwell cut him off. He had done nothing. But the way he was watching, the way his eyes moved between Hargrove's recording phone and the overhead camera feeds and the cluster of civilian phones still pointed at the scene, suggested that whatever calculation he was running, the numbers were not coming out in his favor. Cain had retreated to the corridor near the administrative offices. Through the glass partition, his phone was visible at his ear. He had been on it for 6 minutes straight. On the airport monitors overhead, the flat screens that ordinarily cycled through departure times and airline advertisements, a security supervisor had accidentally routed the flat, live feed from one of the checkpoint cameras. The footage played in silence on a screen visible to 40 or 50 people in the terminal, the wide-angle view of the pre-check lane, the moment Caldwell stepped into Grant's path, the interaction that followed, and the assault itself replaying on a loop, in high definition, in a public airport, while the people involved were still standing 30 feet away. Someone noticed it after 4 minutes and cut the feed. By then, the footage had been recorded on at least 6 phones and uploaded to 3 separate platforms. The first clip had been viewed 11,000 times before the feed went dark. A local news alert had already gone out. A national outlet's social media account had shared a link. Kane's phone call stretched to 11 minutes. At 8:31, 2 FBI special agents in dark suits entered the terminal concourse through the main security doors. They moved without urgency, the measured, deliberate pace of people who had already been briefed and understood exactly what they were walking into. They identified themselves to the TSA supervisor, scanned the space with practiced efficiency, and made their way toward the pre-check checkpoint. Caldwell was still in the terminal. He had not been moved, had not been suspended, had not been separated from the scene. He stood near the rope line with the posture of someone who had not yet accepted that the situation had changed irreversibly. The agents did not go to him first. They went to Judge Grant. The investigation was formal within the posture. The FBI's Miami field office opened a federal civil rights case at 9:15 in the morning, while Judge Grant was still being assessed at the airport medical station. By 10 o'clock, agents had issued subpoenas for all 7 security camera systems in the terminal concourse. By noon, they had formally requested Caldwell's body camera footage. The department's initial response was that the body camera had malfunctioned. It had not. A standard cloud backup protocol, activated automatically at the start of every shift, had preserved the full recording, including the 6 minutes of footage captured before Caldwell's camera was manually switched off. The recovery took agents approximately 40 minutes. What the footage showed was not a malfunction. What it showed was Caldwell, standing near the pre-check entrance minutes before Judge Grant arrived, turning to Landry with a look of deliberate intention. "Watch me deal with this one." The words were recorded in full. The smirk that followed was recorded in full. The timestamp placed it at 7:38, 4 minutes before Judge Grant reached the lane. Agents began interviewing department personnel within 24 hours. What they found, threaded through 16 years of paper records and recovered email archives, was not a single officer who had crossed a line. It was a department that had built the line around him. Lieutenant Harlan had received 29 formal complaints against Caldwell, 29, filed by travelers, airline staff, TSA personnel, and in 2 cases by other law enforcement officers who had witnessed his conduct firsthand. Harlan had dismissed every one. The language varied: insufficient evidence, unverifiable claims, no corroborating footage, but the pattern did not vary. Not once, in 16 years, had any complaint against Caldwell resulted in a formal hearing. Not once had any supervisor placed a written warning in his file. His personnel record, by the time FBI analysts reviewed it in full, contained commendations that had been processed the same weeks that complaints were dismissed. He had been promoted twice. Among the recovered emails, agents found something that required a separate subpoena to fully document. A chain of internal department messages, running across a private group thread used by a rotating cast of officers, showed evidence of an active, recurring betting pool. Officers wagered on how many minority travelers they could redirect from pre-check and priority lanes in a given week. The pool had been running, based on the earliest recoverable email, for at least 4 years. Caldwell's name appeared in the thread repeatedly. So did Harlan's. So did the names of 11 other officers currently assigned to the airport. The emails were detailed. They were dated. They were saved on department servers. And then, there was what the investigation uncovered about Judge Grant herself. 14 months before she stepped into that pre-check lane, she had been appointed by the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division to chair a covert task force examining racial profiling practices at major U.S. airports. The task force had been assembled quietly, no press announcement, no public record, and it had been operating under a confidentiality protocol designed to preserve the integrity of any eventual prosecution. Miami International Airport had been on its radar for 11 months. Anonymous complaints from travelers, cross-referenced with flight records, statistical analyses of TSA routing data, and interviews conducted under the protection of sealed federal subpoenas, had already produced a substantial evidentiary record by the time Judge Grant boarded her flight that morning. The task force had documentation. It had witnesses. It had data patterns that demonstrated, with quantitative precision, the disparity in how black travelers were screened, delayed, and redirected at Miami's pre-check and priority lanes. What it had not yet had was an incident significant enough to make the case publicly undeniable. Judge Grant had deliberately chosen to travel without her security detail. She had traveled that same route, through that same terminal, 11 times over the preceding 14 months, moving without announcement, without protection, without anything that distinguished her from any other black woman in a business suit passing through a busy airport. She had been collecting. Watching the system operate as it actually operated, not as it performed when it knew it was being evaluated. On the morning of the assault, she had been carrying not only her judicial credentials and travel documentation, but a sealed folder of preliminary task force findings that she had planned to deliver in person to a DOJ attorney in Washington after the Supreme Court hearing. Caldwell had not stumbled into a confrontation with a judge. He had detonated a bomb. The federal grand jury convened 3 weeks after the incident. The indictments came down on a Thursday morning. Caldwell was charged under 18 United States Code Section 242 assault, under color of law, along with conspiracy, filing false reports, and obstruction of justice. The charges carried a combined maximum of 20 years in federal prison. Harlan was indicted for conspiracy and failure to intervene. His 16 years of protected dismissals reconstructed in precise detail by the task force's legal team. Cain was charged with obstruction and abuse of authority for his attempt to manage the scene, collect witness devices, and steer the incident toward internal review. Landry took a different path. Faced with the body camera footage, the recovered emails, and statements from 17 other officers who had already been interviewed, Landry accepted an immunity agreement and agreed to testify before the grand jury. His testimony was direct. The behavior at the pre-check lanes had not been a secret. It had been known throughout the department. Officers who objected had been transferred or pushed out. Officers who participated had been promoted. He had been told, at the time of his assignment, what was expected of him, and what he was not to report. The department's leadership had known. They had allowed it. Some of them had encouraged it. 19 additional victims came forward in the weeks following the indictments. A cardiothoracic surgeon who had been turned away from pre-check 3 times in a single year and told his credentials were insufficient despite traveling with hospital identification, surgical privileges, documentation, and a letter from the hospital's legal department. The wife of a Fortune 500 chief executive, detained for 40 minutes on her way to a board meeting, told by Caldwell that her behavior had been suspicious. She had been reading. An Olympic sprinter, returning from a national team training camp with credentials issued by the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee, who had been handcuffed and held in a secondary screening room for 90 minutes, while Caldwell insisted the credentials were unofficial. Each of them had filed complaints. Each of those complaints had been dismissed by Lieutenant Harlan. The civil settlement was reached 18 months after the indictment. The terms included financial damages for Judge Grant and each of the 19 additional victims, a consent decree requiring the complete restructuring of the Miami Airport Police Department's training, oversight, and complaint review processes, and the appointment of an independent federal monitor with authority to audit the department's operations for a minimum of 5 years. The total settlement figure was one of the largest civil rights awards in the history of airport law enforcement in the United States. Caldwell, Harlan, and Cain were convicted at trial. Caldwell received 17 years. Harlan received 9. Cain received 6, the jury finding that his obstruction, while deliberate, had begun after the primary crimes had already been committed. The betting pool thread, 4 years of documented, deliberate racial harassment reduced to digital evidence and read aloud in a federal courtroom became the centerpiece of the prosecution's closing argument. Judge Felicia Grant returned to the bench 11 weeks after the place's won. Assault. Her shoulder had been surgically repaired. The laceration below her left eye had healed to a thin, barely visible scar. She had given no press conferences, issued no public statements beyond the required legal disclosures, and declined all interview requests. She had continued working throughout, reviewing briefs, issuing opinions, managing her docket from a temporary office at the courthouse, while her chambers were prepared for her return. On the morning she came back, she walked through the courthouse entrance, passed through security with her judicial credentials, and proceeded to her chambers without ceremony. She had a full docket. The 7 cameras that had recorded every second of what happened in that terminal had not created the justice that followed. The work had created it 22 years of prosecution, 14 months of careful investigation, and the quiet endurance of a woman who had understood, long before that morning, that the most powerful thing she could do was to keep going. The cameras had simply made sure that this time, there was nowhere left to hide. And for every officer who had ever believed that power was best exercised in the blind spots in the places where the cameras did not reach, where the complaints went to die, where the people targeted would never have the standing to fight back the footage from Miami International Airport on that Tuesday morning, served as a permanent, publicly available answer. The blind spots were gone. The gatekeeper had been seen.
If justice means something to you, like this video and share it. Let the algorithm know stories like this deserve to be heard. Subscribe so you never miss the next one, because trust me, they keep coming. Comment below what part of this story had you speechless. I will be down there reading. Until next time, stay sharp and never let anyone make you forget who you are.